I'm John Samet. Let me welcome you all to today's seminar sponsored by the FAMRI, the Flight Attendants Medical Research Institute Center of Excellence at Johns Hopkins and the Institute for Global Tobacco Control, and anybody else who wants to be a sponsor. We're pleased today to have Mary Bassett, Deputy Commissioner of the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, here to talk about tobacco control, the New York City experience. Mary has extensive experience in public health. She's a graduate of Radcliffe undergraduate, Columbia Medical School, the University of Washington for public health. She's worked extensively abroad, and she reminded me that we first met in the airport in Johannesburg several years ago. She's an associate editor for the American Journal of Public Health and has written extensively on many issues, including racial differences in disease occurrence and disease outcome. Now, one of the reasons that this talk is particularly timely, because at the moment in our state, once again, the Clean Indoor Air Act is up for consideration. This is the Clean Indoor Air Act of 2007. Unfortunately, we've had the Clean Indoor Air Acts of 2006, 2005, and so on. And at this point, we do not yet have a statewide law for making all workplaces smoke-free. As you know, Baltimore does not have such a law. Montgomery County was the first county in the state to have one. So once again, a bill is being considered, and I think all of us are hopeful that perhaps this year will pass and we will join the rising number of smoke-free states. But the experience in New York is certainly relevant to our work here in Maryland. So very pleased to have Mary here today to talk to us. Thank you for coming, Mary.
Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I know that I'm going to be sort of preaching to the converted, but the main reason that I thought it was personally worth a trip down is because I want to convince you, using some of the data that we have from New York City, of the public health importance of a legislative approach to limiting exposure to secondhand smoke. So I'm going to show you a lot of slides, but there are only three things that you need to remember. One is that secondhand smoke kills, and that nobody should have to be exposed to secondhand smoke to earn a living. The next is that we can save lives by passing smoke-free legislation of the sort that Professor Samet just showed you. And the third, and the argument that's always made, is that it's not going to hurt business. Secondhand smoke kills. Smoke-free air acts save lives, and it won't hurt business. So let me turn then to our experience in New York City. And just start out by reminding you, we all think of the pulmonary effects of smoking, and I want to show this slide just to remind you that it affects just about every organ in the body, cigarette smoking. A host of chronic diseases, cancers. And globally, tobacco is exacting a huge burden. Nearly 1 in every 4 people is now a smoker. 1 billion people are going to die from tobacco this century if we don't take action, and half of them prematurely. And the global economic cost is huge. and will increase. By 2040, it's estimated that it will reach $1 trillion. In the U.S., we also have a huge burden from smoking-related ill health. We have 46 million smokers nationally. 440,000 die each year from tobacco-related causes. And the cost to our economy is huge, nearly $160 billion. Youth are affected. Kids start smoking every day. And smoking continues to lower life expectancy, beginning with increasing infant mortality. Now, it's important to translate these sort of astounding figures into local terms, and that's what we did in New York City, where before the Smoke-Free Air Act, we had 1.2 million smokers, a third of whom will die of a smoking-related illness. We had more than 200,000 New Yorkers with smoking-related illness. We identified that 40 New York City kids became regular smokers every day, and further, that 1 New Yorker dies every hour from a smoking-related illness, or 10,000 people each year. Smoking is the leading preventable cause of death in New York City, in Baltimore, in the U.S. Here you see that we estimated 10,000 deaths related to smoking, of which 1,000 are attributable to secondhand smoke. That's exposure to other people's cigarette smoke. So with this epidemiology, these facts on the impact of tobacco on health in mind, New York City crafted a 5-point platform which focused on taxation, legal action, cessation, public education, and finally, evaluation. I'm going to speak today mainly about the legal strategies, the smoke-free workplace laws, but I want to make the point that tobacco control requires a comprehensive strategy which can be encompassed by these 5 points. And taxation is particularly important. Tobacco products are price sensitive, and the very first thing that New York City did under the Bloomberg administration and the leadership of Tom Frieden, the health commissioner, was to increase the tax on New York City cigarettes. At the time, combined with the New York state tax, the tax in New York City was $3 per pack, and the highest excise tax in the country. It meant that cigarettes cost about $7.50 a pack. Now other cities have increased their taxes. I think Chicago now has the highest excess tax. New York now ranks 6th. If we could get the political will, we'd raise the tax again. But so far we haven't been able to. The state actually has to assist us in raising tax. It's not something that can be done by our local city council alone. This graph shows the impact on smoking, on cigarette sales with the introduction of the New York City tax. You can see in the purple line there this sharp reduction in cigarettes sales. But there's been a problem with cigarettes. We have tax sales going down, but this slide shows that we have smuggling increasing. So if you look at the line that says another person on the street, you'll see that this has gone up to nearly approaching 10% of cigarette sales, so that the total non-tax cigarettes or smuggled cigarettes has increased. We've been able to lower internet sales, but we still are working with our police authorities on tackling the problems of street sales. So legal actions include not only strengthening smoke-free laws, but figuring out how to reduce cigarette tax evasion. We wish we could do more to restrict the tobacco industry's marketing and promotion activities, but these we are preempted at the federal level, and the industry is protected by commercial free speech. In fact, they can even claim it as a tax write-off. But the number one legal action is the one that Baltimore is considering now, and that's smoke-free workplace It should, though, be considered in the context of a comprehensive policy. Now, key to smoke-free workplace laws is an understanding of secondhand smoke. And you know all about that. Dr. Samet has participated in the Surgeon General's reports. The most recent one came out last summer that said that there was no safe level of secondhand smoke. Secondhand smoke turned smoking into a communicable disease. It meant that we could no longer were we forced to cast it as a personal choice, because it was a personal choice that could affect the others. So secondhand smoke kills, and this is critical to our legal responsibility and public health imperative to regulate exposure to secondhand smoke. And it's important to get that out in framing the debate, to assure that the public is aware that it's incontrovertible that secondhand smoke kills. I'm always astonished. We go around testifying in other localities. I went to Philadelphia. Sarah Pearl, our Assistant Commissioner for Tobacco Control, was here in Baltimore in October to testify before your city council. And there's always somebody who says maybe, there are a lot of maybes about this still. There are no more maybes about the risks of secondhand smoke. But the industry will continue to find allies who will raise questions about the science. The next important point to make is that smoke-free workplace laws will save lives, and that it is a worker health and safety issue. I started out by saying that it should be framed as no one should be forced to risk their health to earn a living, that we have a public health responsibility to report, to maintain a safe workplace, and that all workers, including bar and restaurant employees, deserve equal protection. And it's important to personalize this conversation. I talked personally with somebody who worked in a bar as a waitress, who, when she became pregnant, had to give up that job or risk her unborn child and her health. And she gave up earning the money that her kid also needed or would need in order to protect her health. So this is a worker safety issue. And the last point is that it is not a trade-off between health and economics. It's a fair question to raise. It was a fair question to raise in California in 1995 when they, and 98 when they limited smoking in all restaurants and bars. A fair question perhaps to ask in New York when we passed the legislation in 2002. But we now have plenty of evidence that the expansion of smoke-free public spaces for the hospitality industry will have at least a neutral effect and often a positive effect on their economies. Now, there is one industry that's hurt by these laws, and these are internal documents from Philip Morris. In red, that's the part you're supposed to read. This is what they had to say about smoke-free workplace laws. They do reduce cigarette consumption, and they reduce the volume of sales of the tobacco industry. And they point out that having these designated areas is much less effective in promoting quits than having a smoke-free workplace. And they also worried about the financial impact on their industry. And this is, in large part, the reason that they fought so hard against these laws. We turned the data, as I've said, into local data using the CDC's, and it's available on the web, estimates of secondhand smoke and impact on mortality. We calculated that there were about 1,000 New Yorkers who died each year, and we broke it down by from heart disease, stroke, lung cancer, SIDS, and so on. We present these data. For some people, it's a little complicated. The hospitality industry said, sort of show us the death certificates because they want to see the death certificate that says died of secondhand smoke. So these are from models projecting the risks of secondhand smoke exposure from population data to come up with an estimate of the number of deaths attributable to each category. They didn't include diseases that are usually directly the effect of smoking as opposed to secondhand smoke. And we also figured out the impact in terms of ill health. And finally, the impact in terms of worker exposure. In New York, we're lucky to have a community health survey, which is a BRFSS type survey that collects regular data from households with a telephone survey. We do 10,000 households a year, and it permits us to get estimates of risk behavior down to the neighborhood level. So we have a lot of data, and we were able to, document that 14% of non-smoking workers were regularly exposed to secondhand smoke on the job. The Surgeon General estimates that about half of non-smokers are exposed to secondhand smoke. We did a little study showing that you could stand in the Holland Tunnel. I don't know how many of you know New York. It's one of our main commuter thoroughfares. You could stand there for hours and not get exposed to as much air pollution as measured by particulate matter as you would in any one of these 3 bars. And people generally agree that the Holland Tunnel is not a great place to stand. And we also presented these data showing that it would also help workers who smoked to reduce their cigarettes consumption. These are more quotes from internal documents of Philip Morris. The economic arguments often used by the industry to scare off smoking ban activity were no longer working. These arguments simply had no credibility with the public, which isn't surprising, right, these Philip Morris internal document writers, which isn't surprising when you consider that our dire predictions in the past rarely came true. So I wish we could get this across to at least just one politician who has the ability to make a decision for Baltimore. We have growing data, particularly strong data from California, which is now nearly 1 decade into being smoke-free. They outlawed smoking in bars in 1998. And what they found is that overall, the smoking ban had a positive effect on all food and drink establishments. They also found that piecemeal bans are more difficult politically for the industry to accept. They work best when it's seen as a level playing field where everybody has to go smoke-free together. And in time, even bar patrons come to support the bans. Now, what they did, though, was a piecemeal ban. They first banned in restaurants, and their restaurant revenue increased. Then they banned it in bars, where they found, interestingly, an increase in bar revenue. And they explained this by the behavior reported by smokers and non-smokers. It went like this, that first, the ban may limit the number of smokers who go to restaurants because they can't smoke there. But this is offset by an increase in the number of non-smokers. And remember, everywhere, non-smokers greatly outnumber smokers. So non-smokers like smoke-free establishments. Probably many of you have left places which you've found too smoky. So they offset the loss of smokers. And they then went more frequently to restaurants than to bars, choosing them actively because they preferred the restaurant's smoke-free environment. Then when the bar ban came along, the smokers had no reason to pick the bar over the restaurant, so they started going both places. So in the end, they found a revenue increase for both bars and restaurants associated with being smoke-free. So that's what happened in California. There are data from numerous jurisdictions, and this slide summarizes 26 well-designed studies that found either no effect or a positive effect on economic measures. The measures range from sales to employment levels to number of establishments, and these studies have been done all over the country. So smoke-free laws don't hurt business. The other thing to point out to people is that there's no such thing as a non-smoking section. And this was I even recognized some of the people. They're health department people in the slide who went out somewhere and took this picture as part of our public education campaign. I always remember my experience. As you heard, I lived overseas for many years, and I got on a plane once that was run by Bulgarian Airways. It was a Bulgarian Airways plane, Balkan Airlines, and they said, smoking or non-smoking? And I said, non-smoking, and they said, on your right. So why, and on an airplane, it seems ridiculous. Why we ever accepted it in a restaurant, I can't really say. But there is no such thing as a non-smoking section. We used outreach like that to gain more public support for the idea that having a smoke-free food and drink establishments would be good. And you can see here that when we started out, the law went into effect in March of 2003. So we did a baseline there in March of 2002, where still the majority of people supported having a Smoke-Free Air Act. But you can see that as we mobilized and got more public attention to the matter, that we got more and more support, going up to 75%. And we asked the question, if there were a total ban on cigarette smoking, would you go more often, less often, or would it make not much of a difference to people in a poll? And you can see that most people said that it wouldn't make much of a difference. And a fair number of people said that they would actually go more often. Now, it's really important. So getting these data was important. It was also important because it kept things in the public eye. It meant that we had a media moment to talk about our poll findings. And we also found that it was important to word the questions appropriately. If you say we want to require owners to ban smoking in their food establishments, you're more likely to get a negative response than if you ask, do you think we should protect workers from exposure to secondhand smoke? And these findings of public support, have been pretty universal. Now, that doesn't mean to say that there wasn't some political risk. And at the time that this is the New York Post, it's our leading tabloid newspaper, and the mayor at the time was unpopular on a number of fronts. New York, following 9/11, experienced a significant economic recession. Well, at least in whether it was caused by 9/11, I can't say. So the mayor had raised property taxes, something that's never very popular, and then he went ahead and banned cigarettes. And he was told that this was going to cost him enormously politically, and headlines like this suggested it might be so, bar humbug. And you can see that the mayor, though, always was within 6 months of signing the Smoke-Free Air Act, he had the majority of New Yorkers on his side. We put a lot of effort into ensuring high rates of compliance with the law. And from the outset, about 97% of restaurants were compliant. We focused on making it clear that it was the owners who were responsible for assuring that their establishments were smoke-free, not the patrons. The owners had to make sure that they got rid of all ashtrays. Having an ashtray was a violation, and they were required to post prominently signs that we made available. We sent them out and we made them downloadable in their establishments, explaining that there was no smoking. The fines were not instituted for a period of several months so that we could institute it as an educational initiative. And then, since then, although we have inspectors going out to ensure that the laws are rigorously enforced, the main strategy really is self-enforcing. The patrons themselves complain if they see smoking. We sent out lots of information for owners. And then we've turned our attention to try and evaluate the health impact as well as the economic impact of this legislation. And this has been a hallmark of Tom Frieden's leadership, is a large investment in the collection of data that can help document the impact of our work. So we know that we now have fewer New Yorkers exposed to secondhand smoke, both at home and at work, and that overall, we put this at 157,000 fewer non-smoking New Yorkers exposed to secondhand smoke, either at home or at work. And the air quality, which I showed you we'd measured, has improved enormously in the bars where, following the implementation of the legislation. And we also did direct measures of serum cotinine among New York State bar and restaurant workers, and the cotinine levels dropped by 85%. So there's no doubt that for workers this has meant a huge reduction in their exposure. And this has been found everywhere, that these laws have been passed. These data are from California. The blue tall bars show before the law was passed, and the orange bars, they are orange, yes. 8 weeks after the law, you can see that everywhere the exposure to and the consequences of exposure to secondhand smoke improved enormously. These are things like wheezing, cough, eye, nose and throat irritation. And this is our graph on the New York City economy and the impact of the smoke-free air legislation. The first laws were passed in 1995, which limited smoking in most public places, not including restaurants and bars. And here you have the data from 2002. I mean, what you can see here is that the success of the hospitality industry really correlates with the overall performance of the economy. And there isn't much, any noticeable effect here of the smoke-free air legislation. When we have recession, small businesses suffer. When the economy improves, the small businesses, including restaurants and bars, do better. And this is what happened in New York. We have documented an increasing number of active liquor licenses since that have been continued to increase following 2002, and they are still increasing. And the tax receipts from bar and restaurants also have continued to increase. And we've achieved overwhelming compliance with the law. But the concerns and complaints didn't go away. The New York Post continued to raised concerns that restaurants were being harmed economically. This is from Staten Island, which is sort of a unique province of New York City. And they have their own newspaper, and they continue to raise concerns that the smoking ban was hurting small businesses there. So the tobacco industry typically tries to promote this sort of anxiety and concern. It's not a data-driven strategy. It's a political strategy that's used by the tobacco industry and its allies. I understand that you haven't had this idea that you can get special ventilation systems introduced here in Baltimore. Typically, the industry talks about that as well. We can we can somehow filter the air. These things don't work. They raise them frequently. They lobby local elected officials. They trot out scary stories. They find individual bar or restaurant owners who say that they'll be driven out of business. And this is to be expected. But these predictions just didn't come true in New York, and they haven't come true anywhere. They said that restaurants would lose up to a quarter of their business, but restaurant sales increased. They said that the industry would lose 11,000 jobs, but 19,000 new jobs were created. They said that the tourists wouldn't come to New York City because they didn't want to come. You know, everyone knows Europeans like to smoke. Even France is going smoke-free in stages. But, you know, and then they've turned smoking into an art form. But anyway, the idea was that Europeans wouldn't come to New York City anymore because and this was 10, 15 years ago. It didn't happen then. Have I skipped that? Yeah. And in fact, tourism increased. And this is all the experience of the 1995 Smoke-Free Act. So the things that seemed to be critical in New York City were to gain political support. We were lucky to have a health commissioner who was able to get a mayor, who you all are familiar with as an advocate for and supporter of public health, as well as the head of the city council's health committee, bipartisan support for the legislation. We kept front and center the notion that workers have a right to breathe smoke-free air when they go to work. So we kept workers' rights as the prime concern, not smokers' rights, in talking about this legislation. And as I said, we personalized it by getting actual affected workers to speak out and working with advocates. We have worked hard to document that business won't be hurt. But as I said, this is probably the most potent argument against smoke-free legislation. So you have to expect to hear it. And this is what New York found 1 year after the 2002 Smoke-Free Air Act, that business and restaurants and bars had increased by nearly 9%, that employment in restaurants and bars had also increased, that air quality had improved, levels of cotinine, as you saw, had declined, and that we had fewer New Yorkers exposed to secondhand smoke. We're pleased with this strategy because it was not a piecemeal strategy. We didn't leave out any restaurants or bars, and we kept a level playing field for the industry by having all sectors go smoke-free at the same time. And I had to put this New Yorker cartoon in. You'll get there. I don't know if all of you can read it, but it's at the bottom it reads, "Would you like to go to my place for a cigarette?" So we're now up to the stage where the New Yorker is making cartoons about it. So we've survived, and the strategy has proved very, very popular. I want to show you some of our data on prevalence, which of course is key to the goal of the health department to reduce smoking prevalence. So although the Smoke-Free Air Act has as its initial goal making a safer workplace, our ultimate goal is to beat California in terms of our smoking prevalence rates. Is to drive down smoking prevalence. So here are data on teen smoking. These are from the YRBSS, the Youth Risk and Behavioral Surveillance Study, which is done using a standardized format in New York City public high schools. It's overseen by the CDC. And you can see that smoking has the top line is the U.S. rates overall, and you can see that smoking rates in New York City teens in our public high schools have gone down considerably, now stand at 11%. It's less than half the national rate and represents more than 50% decline in the last 8 years. And this is what's happened in New York City to our prevalence rates. For a period of some years, the prevalence of smoking was really stalled at around 21, 22%. And you can see that following the Smoke-Free Air Act passed in 2002, implemented in 2003, we had a marked decline in the smoking prevalence. Since then, we've been bouncing around a bit. This lowest point was 18.4%. That was 2004. 2005, 18.9%. So we would have been delighted to see the rate continue to plummet, but it hasn't. We'll have 2006 data available soon. We've layered on a number of initiatives to achieve this decline. I mentioned the tax, the smoke-free workplace, and I haven't mentioned a more recent initiative, which was the nicotine patch program, which we began in 2005. We know that most smokers who smoke want to quit. Most of them try to quit. About 60% of New York City smokers in any given year make an effort to quit. This is across all ethnic groups. And most people who quit cold turkey, and therefore have a harder time quitting than people who have assisted quits using nicotine replacement. So we've so far delivered nearly 200,000 free patches to New York City residents, people who call our public access number 311 during a sort of series of campaigns. We've now run 3 of them. We're going to run another one in April. They are screened, and if they're eligible, we mail them a 6-week course of nicotine replacement therapy. And we've been able to reach about 10% of smokers, and among those who we were able to reach 6 months later, 30% said that they'd stopped smoking. If we considered that everyone we didn't reach continued to smoke, 20% of the people who received the patch stopped smoking. And that's about a 3-fold better performance by self-report than most cold turkey quit programs. So this is one of our cessation efforts. And we're also beginning to think of media as an important cessation strategy. One thing that's critical is to keep smoking in the news as a health hazard, one way or the other, either through earned media, which you get when you try and pass laws like the one you're trying to pass here in Baltimore, or by purchasing media, which we've lately been doing in New York City in the biggest way the health department has ever done. We've been running a very hard-hitting campaign showing a scary campaign. That's an artery there in the upper left-hand corner. That's a brain that's had a stroke. That's Pam, who dies. She is a smoker who dies of smoking-related illness. And that's Raymond, who has a tracheostomy. And you can, Ronaldo, sorry. You can see that he, it's shown quite graphically what smoking has done to him. We had a campaign that was it was called Everyone Loves a Smoker. I loved the campaign. It was about, moms quitting for their daughters, guys quitting with their friends. But it turns out that what really gets people going is the scary stuff, what smoking will do to their bodies. And we know this because we track calls to our public access number, 311. And when we show the nice sort of quit to protect your family media, we don't get calls. When we show this sort of thing, we get a lot of calls. So we switched over now to a hard-hitting campaign and are investing as heavily in it as we can manage using a health department budget. The industry spends about at least $50 billion, it may be more by now, on media a year. So we can't match that, but we have been investing much more heavily than in the past. And we think that this also will help drive cessation. When I spoke to Dr. Samet before coming down here, he wondered whether there was a slide that showed what's happening to the nation in terms of smoke-free laws. And this is it. This is the West Coast. I'm sorry, the East Coast here. I don't know if you can all see it. But it shows that the march is on. That we have over a dozen states that have smoke-free air legislation, and a growing number that have eliminated smoking also in restaurants and bars. So on the East Coast, you have New York State, that's Massachusetts, and all those little triangles are localities. There are over 2,000 localities that have now passed this type of legislation. You can see that Massachusetts has many, many smoke-free towns. Connecticut has something, New York, New Jersey, it looks like parts of Delaware. So we know that Philadelphia has passed smoke-free legislation. Washington, D.C. has passed it. I think that the question for Baltimore is not whether, but when, and how many lives it's going to cost in the interim. All right, I think that I'll stop there. Oh, this is the international scene. These are the countries. So you can see that the number of countries planning or that have implemented smoke-free legislation is also hit the takeoff point. So I think that there's no question that the tide has turned on this and that we will see more and more smoke-free legislation in the future. Thank you very much.
We now have time for discussion, comments, and questions for Mary about the New York City experience or coming discussions here. Yes, Deborah.
When you looked at the economic impact on bars, did you look at it by type of bar? Because the one big argument they have here is that it's going to hurt the little neighborhood bars.
Right.
And since they're not trendy, that are going to pull in yuppies and people like that, that's the argument.
Right, that's a good question. We've presented all of our data in aggregate, but we do have more and more bar licenses. But to answer the question, can we assure that any given little neighborhood bar will survive? Well, that's a question that we can't answer, period. This is a risky industry, and this, it's possible that any bar might go under, smoke-free or not smoke-free. So, the assurance that everyone will survive is one that smoke-free advocates can't make. It's a risky industry, period,
Yes.
smoke-free or not.
Did many bars try to circumvent the laws by becoming private clubs?
Well, there was in the New York City legislation agreement that you could have a room which no worker would go into, which would where there would be no service in that room, but that was preempted by the state regulations. And no, we have not seen bars turning into private clubs to circumvent the law. We haven't even seen many requests for waiver. There was a waiver on offer for establishments that experience severe economic hardship, and we just haven't seen that many requests for waivers. In fact, it turns out that the economic threat is not the one that's been projected.
In the back?
One of the concerns about this legislation is with the increased patronage to bars and pubs, there's going to be a drinking problem. Have you experienced this in Europe or does any other states experience rising binge drinking or
Huh. That's interesting. No, I haven't even had the question asked. I mean, the thing that I don't know the answer to that sometimes comes up is that it increases noise because people who are smokers congregate outside of establishments to smoke, and that in neighborhoods where people used to be inside, they now are outside. But I haven't heard the argument made that this is going to sort of drive the non-smokers into bars and turn them into drinkers.
Yes.
Do you think beginning this process in restaurants kind of helped the trend change instead of starting it all in restaurants and bars in the beginning restaurants, so we had some data to see if it was hurting the patronism or not, and it seemed like the bars followed. But do you think that was a good way to start this strategy?
Well, in New York, we did restaurants and bars at the same time. And we thought that was a good idea because it meant that there was a level playing field, that we weren't picking and choosing one part of the industry to, quote, suffer from going smoke-free. In Philadelphia, I believe they've limited the smoke-free legislation to restaurants and bars that serve food. So they have, I assume that was a compromise born of concern for bars that were purely drinking establishments. But there's a strong case to be made that maintaining a level playing field for the hospitality industry is a better strategy for everyone.
Mary, can you say something about the enforcement, the willingness of the police to take it on, and have they had to? You mentioned that much of this was self-enforcing, but initially was there willingness to engage this issue on the part of the police?
Well, the way we've enforced it is with our restaurant inspectors. So we have nearly 25,000 food service establishments in New York, and they're all inspected and licensed by the health department. So these inspectors added smoke-free inspections to their lists, and they did respond to complaints which was the self-enforcing part. They're now going to be adding trans fats.
I was trying not to have you say that word, then we get new questions. Ron?
Follow up to that, could you say something about the complaint rates from patrons? Has it gone up, stayed flat, gone down? How does that relate?
I haven't looked at that. I know it went up. It was up for a while following the smoke-free legislation, and I just don't. I suspect that it's gone down, but I haven't looked at those data. I don't think that there are many complaints, but I'd have to look at it.
Other comments or questions? I'm actually reminded of one of the first books I know of that covered the story of secondhand smoke was written about the late 70s by Roy Shepard, who's in Toronto, and he actually begins his book by describing being on the subway in Toronto and somebody was smoking illegally, and he asked him to put out the cigarette. And the next thing he found himself on the floor of the train with a broken nose.
Yeah.
And so we certainly have come a long way on this issue. I had the opportunity to testify before the City Council in the hearings back in February 2002, something like that. And it was quite interesting because all the arguments were played out, and they've been played out over and over again in hearing after hearing after hearing. And, I think Mary really provided us with, the experience of New York. I mean, really, who would have ever believed that New York would be smoke-free? And here it is, very successfully done with remarkable public health impact. So I think we all have to hope that we will see a similar story play out here in Baltimore and in our state. We certainly won't be the first, but we shouldn't be the last. So for those of you wanting lunch, it's out there. And again, thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much for having us.